respectful dialogue. Welcome to Crossing Boundaries, Global Connections and Conversations, the one podcast that helps you discover that far more unites us than divides us. I'm Kim Passi-Yosef, the Director of Operations at MEJDI Tours, and this is my co-host, Global Peace Advocate, National Geographic Explorer, and Palestinian, Aziz Abu Sera. Hi, Aziz.
Hi, Kim. Thank you. This is our new intro that I was supposed to be part of and didn't memorize my part as we moving into podcast. I think we wanted to do this today as a live stream because of everything is going on in Israel and Palestine. And we thought bringing some of us here, having this conversation, talk about the realities on the ground. We are supposed to be joined by one more person who I think is having technical difficulties joining, Mu'tasim, who's from Bethlehem. So hopefully he'll be able to join soon. But we have two good friends who are joining right now. We have Joel, who's joining us from the States. And Joel, I've known you when you were in ULMEB Alliance for Middle East Peace. That's when I think we met, and you are now, I don't have my notes, so I forgot the name. UNS Daniel Abrams organization, you're the managing director. See, I memorized it actually.
Well done.
And the organization. And Shai Goren, who some of you might know because he has traveled, led some tours for us in Israel and Palestine. And I was with Shai just last week in Jaffa and Tel Aviv. So it's good to see you, Shai, again. And Shai, I think Mu'tasim joined under your name. So awesome. And we reached the 100 again. So I'm sorry, everyone, if a few people can go and join us through Facebook, that would be great. Just for those who don't know that this is the option. If just 4 or 5 people do that, that would be awesome. I appreciate it. We have the Facebook link below. So appreciate it if you do that and allow other people to join. And I thought we could start not with what's happening. I actually thought we could start with what brought us to where we are now. Where did this happen? And I think people who haven't been following the news in the last few weeks will have a hard time understand how did this whole thing explode in just one day or 2 days, which for those of us who've been following, it's no surprise, but those who haven't, I think it is. Shai, you've been quite involved in the last month in things going on. Do you wanna kick us off with that?
Yeah. So hi everybody, and happy holidays to anyone celebrating. As with all this mess, we are having a dual holiday in this weekend. Yeah, let's talk about what happened during the last month, which was Ramadan, just until now. And we'll try to see how that led us to what's happening. Basically, what we're having here is a mixture of a couple of events that all were mixed up together in either a coincidence, or maybe it was a bit more arranged than that. But those have to do with the issues happened in Jerusalem, especially the demonstrations in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, and the fact that Palestinian families were supposed to be evicted on Ramadan month. Which led to Al-Aqsa, right, the holy site for Palestinians and also for Jews, that had clashes of the police coming in and having clashes with the Palestinians. We also had some issues around what is known as Bab al-Amud or Damascus Gate, which I'll get to as well. We need to talk about the elections that were canceled, Palestinians' elections, and the fact that Israel just had elections. And to all of that, maybe we can add the fact that Israel has a new police staff, has a new chief of staff of the police. He's new, he didn't have experience in his position, and also the district manager, we can say, or commander of Jerusalem itself. In one of the demonstrations in Sheikh Jarrah, which was just a month and a bit ago, we saw more police brutality than before. Now, Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood where Jews used to live before 1948, and the Israeli law allows them to get back to their homes. The Israeli law doesn't allow the same thing for the Palestinian families, which would be evicted. A few already have been, and others might be. So those demonstrations have been going on for about 12 years. And those demonstrations are Palestinians first and foremost, but there is a good number of Israeli Jews who are joining those demonstrations. And in the one that happened on April 9th, we saw the member of Israeli parliament, Ofer Kassif, is an Israeli Jew, beaten up by the Israeli police, which add, I would say, to the demonstration that happened on the next week, and also to the fire and to the broadcasting around Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. A few days after that, we saw the police going to one of the major sitting areas in East Jerusalem, which is Damascus Gate, and shutting down the staircase around that using kind of barracks. The police didn't have a very good answer to why are they doing that, and that started clashes between the police and between Palestinian youth. A couple of days after that, we had the Israeli Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers. On that day, the Waqf organization that's running Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, talked about how the police told them to shut down their speakers during the call of prayer because of a ceremony that happened in the Western Wall. So the first time that Al-Aqsa is also coming into that. And just one day after that, we saw the first attack on TikTok, a new wave, we can say, of attacks by Palestinian youths to Israeli Jews, and ultra-Orthodox was slapped on the light rail on the tram of Jerusalem, and that led to a few more. We're going to talk today about Israeli pride and what's happening with Israeli people that are lynching Arabs around the cities of Israel right now. That has to do a lot with what started on TikTok. So we're already on April 22nd as members of an organization called Lehava, a very radical, extreme organization, right-wing organization in Jerusalem, that their youngsters were marching in Jerusalem and looking for Arabs that they could beat. The end of that night had to do with few dozens Palestinians that were beaten by the police and ended up in hospitals. A few others were arrested. And by the end of April, by the 25th, the chief of staff of the Israeli police said that putting on the barracks of Damascus Gate shouldn't happen anymore. He didn't say it was a mistake, but he said, let's put down the barracks and reopen the gates, reopen the area. So that's something that the Palestinian youths and activists saw as maybe a victory in Jerusalem. And the Israeli police showed how unpersistent they are. They did the decision, they weren't really backed up by it. And once that led to riots or violence around that, they decided they're changing their decision, which is something that definitely will change in what we're seeing after that. The day after, Abu Mazen Mahmoud Abbas is ordering that he will cancel the demonstrations that were supposed to happen in the Palestinian Authority. Obviously, that led to the fuel as Hamas was the major organization that would win those elections. They got upset. The demonstrations around Sheikh Jarrah get stronger and stronger by the beginning of May, and we're starting to see more Palestinian citizens of Israel joining those demonstrations. People from Al-Fahim, major city in northern Israel, are doing that. And as a response, Itamar Ben-Gvir, a more radical, or maybe the most radical parliament member, Israeli Jew in the Israeli parliament, decided that he's moving his bureau to Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. And then we're seeing major clashes that all goes to Al-Aqsa. The police enters Al-Aqsa and throw flash grenades or stun grenades at Al-Aqsa. And that weekend, we already see 200 Palestinians who are ending up in hospitals. And on the next day, which is last Saturday, the police is stopping Palestinian Israeli citizens, stopping their vehicles on Route 1 on the main way to Jerusalem as they're on the way to Layl al-Qadr, maybe one of the holiest nights of Islam during the year. 3 hours after the police is stopping those buses and not enabling people to go to the holy spot, it actually changes its mind again and saying, okay, they're going to march anyway to Jerusalem, so let's reopen that. So once again, we see maybe a decision of the police that wasn't backed fully. Last Monday is maybe the biggest clash that we had, and that led to everything right now, and that was Jerusalem Day, which is the day that is celebrated by Israeli Jews, mostly from the right wing, to celebrate the unity of the city of Jerusalem, the victory of the Six-Day War in 1967. It has to do with a major march that marches around the old city of Jerusalem and enters through the same Damascus Gate that we talked about, walks through the Muslim Quarter and ends at the Kotel at the Western Wall. During this parade, usually we're hearing threats like death to the Arabs or Muhammad is dead. And there were many attempts by many organizations to ask the police to change the route of that parade. The police didn't change the route of the parade. Hamas joined in and said, okay, we're going to shoot rockets to Jerusalem. And on the last second, the police changes the route of the parade, another decision that is worth to mention. A rocket is fired to Jerusalem outskirts, a small town called Bet Nekufa in the western part, we can say, of Jerusalem, or almost by Jerusalem. And then from Tuesday, Hamas started to shoot towards the major cities of Israel, especially to Tel Aviv, but also all around the coastline. Cities like Ashkelon and Ashdod were hit severely, and obviously the IDF retaliated with shooting rockets at Gaza itself. And for the last couple of days, that's what we're seeing. But the biggest story, I think, and obviously we're going to get to that as well, is the fact that there's a civil war happening in Israel right now. And that has to do with Palestinian citizens of Israel. They make 20% of the population in major mixed cities that have big Palestinian populations and Israeli Jewish population that are just burning in a way that we haven't seen. I don't think we ever saw it before. Lynches that are happening on both sides, police that just cannot or doesn't want to get to areas and is letting people do what they want. And with all of that, yeah, we're getting to where we are today.
Thank you, Shai. And after Shai gave us this kind of ping pong of what's happening, right? One side does this, the other side does that. We want to also open and say that we condemn any violence from any side, and we are looking not to actually take sides, but to create some sort of peace. And I thought to start with a short post that I read that a relative wrote. And I don't know if you'll agree with everything, but he wrote, if you don't live or ever lived here and have no understanding of the situation, it's okay to just pray for peace. You don't have to pick your side or show your solidarity with one on the expense of the other. People are people. Both Israelis and Palestinians deserve peace and better leaderships, free of terror and radicalism. And I feel like one of the reasons we created this meeting, which we haven't done for a few weeks, is to really answer your questions, our listeners. So I want you to feel free to write us through the chat. You can write us on Facebook. And if at any point one of these lovely gentlemen or I say something that you've never heard of or discuss a point that you have more questions about, please, this is the time to ask us questions. We will be sharing the recording and will be available via email as well after the show. So Shai gave us an opening. Let's go to Mutasem. Thank you for joining us. Can you give us a sense of what people in the West Bank are feeling currently? What are you seeing on the news these days?
First, hi, and happy to all of people celebrating that. Again, my name is Mutasem. I'm a colleague of Shai and a good friend, actually, and of definitely Aziz, Kim. Anyway, thanks for joining, and please invite your friends so they could learn more as well about what's happening over here. Now, basically what is happening, the general feeling in the West Bank, it's extremely confusing at the moment. People are somehow are scared from what's gonna happen, or very afraid from what the future is hiding, especially when we see that the violence, unfortunately, is increasing and increasing every second. Wherever you go, even today is the first day of the Eid for the Muslims, but all the houses you enter, the only thing you see on their TV screens is Al Jazeera or whatever the news stations, looking second by second for what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Jerusalem, what's happening in Lod right now, as what we hear. So people feeling that it's insane. Personally, I've never experienced such a thing that happening at the moment, such a situations that happening at the moment. Neither my parents as well, as what they told me. So it's a very mixed picture of feelings, of feeling angry for what's happening for the Palestinians, feeling sad as well, and deeply touching the hearts of people when we see the views on the TV of the victims, both sides, basically the kids, especially now for the last couple of hours in Gaza. People are also feeling that there is, or got a kind of a sense that there is a huge change happening. What happened before Monday or till Monday is at life, and what's coming after this storm ends will be another life. That's what people think in the West Bank.
Thank you, Muhtasem. Joel, how are people in the States or outside here watching what's happening, and what's happening outside that could be helping in stopping what's going on?
Hi, Aziz. It's very interesting. I think for many of the listeners and for lots of people who, whether they're professionally involved like I am, or who have family or friends, or they're passionate, these moments, and I remember back to the first war in Gaza in 2009, I remember to 2014, moments of rage, rage, shame. They're not sure what to do. They follow online. For some people, social media has a negative effect of just complete social media bubbles. I think, as Shai mentioned, so much of the violence that's happening intercommunally within Israel's borders is being spread through social media, and not just from the TikToks, but now especially. And relatives and friends, whether they're Arab or whether they're Jewish or whether they're interested in seeing these and are reposting them, I think people are really unsure what to do, and they're angry. And I think that on a policy level, and that's why I've been working on this for quite a while. I think there's a little bit of frustration that people could see this happening. Shai laid out a roadmap. This isn't like in the summer of 2014 where it seemed like this would come out of the blue and no one knew why things kicked off, right? It was very obvious at the start of Ramadan that things were descending. I think that for people who are watchers of this and people who are involved and speak to people, they could see the writing on the wall a month ago, and they were constantly worried it was going to get worse and worse. And Aziz, I'll tell you, in conversations with colleagues and friends, on Thursday and on Friday, we were calling each other saying, I have never been so scared as I am for what's going to happen on Monday, because of what was going on with Yom Yerushalayim and the protest. Like we were genuinely terrified, and we were calling contacts and colleagues to say we are honestly scared in a way that we haven't been before. And part of that isn't just the normal cycle and the other parts, but new parts, the discoordination of the government in Israel, the changed political calculus for those in charge, the cancelled Palestinian elections, the complete feeling of abandonment by anyone who cares in the international community. All of this stuff felt like it was coming really to a head, and there was no de-escalatory mechanisms. No one activated the Jordanians, the UAE, the Egyptians. We're doing it now, right? Now everyone's sort of running in as the entire situation has imploded. But there was a time it felt like to defuse this bomb, and no one did it, because no one wanted to spend the time or political capital to do it at the senior enough levels. And I don't know, could it have been prevented? Some people will tell you, no, this was always going to happen. I don't know. I think that not doing things is a policy choice as well. I think that for many people watching abroad, there's this deep feeling of helplessness, and this feeling like people have been screaming at us that they were scared and that no one did anything. And so now that it's happened, there's an exasperation as well as a depression of what do we do now? Like, how do you rebuild? But I will say on a more positive note, when you move from sort of the higher echelons of geostrategic politics that drive people nuts to sort of the grassroots work, we do have advantages that we didn't have in 2000, when it was the last real time we saw, this level of violence within Israel towards the Arab community, I'd argue. That there has been a rebirth, not of coexistence, but of shared society. And though there are rotting gangs of Arabs and Jews who have gone around, whether it's in Lod or in Jaffa, we have seen today massive demonstrations at different roundabouts and at different roads of Jews and Arabs, whether it's with Omdim B'Yachad, whether it's with other shared society organizations, coming out and saying we're utterly refusing to allow this to define us. I think that's important. What I would say, Aziz, is that for many of us internationally, what have they been investing in when they look at programs that do, whether it's Arab Jewish work, Israeli Palestinian work? it was never about creating a peace deal. No one's that Pollyannish in 2021. It was about creating a resiliency against violence. And I think the entire field is going through a massive stress test right now. And in some places it's fracturing and splintering, and in other places it's holding. And, you know, as much as it's depressing to see the hundreds of people who are taking violence in their hands, who are forming militias, I also will say it's not tens of thousands of people doing that. There are thousands of people protesting against it. There are brave people who are pulling people out of fires. There are teachers who are standing up. There are members of Knesset from the Arab, from the Joint List, from Ra'am, from parts of the Jewish community, from Meretz, also from Yesh Atid. There are people who are coming out of goodwill, and there is leadership coming out. I think that outside, one of the obligations is also to amplify that, and how we can do that authentically in a way that isn't trying to avoid the structural violence that has been a leading up to this acute violence, but in order to create that space so that we can once again start dealing with that structural violence that Palestinians face, whether it's within Israel, whether it's in East Jerusalem, or whether it's in the West Bank and Gaza.
Joe, can I pick on that last point? Because this is a question I have, honestly, and it hit me mostly last week when I was in Jerusalem and I was walking from East Jerusalem to West Jerusalem. And in East Jerusalem, you could hear stun grenades, tear gas, rubber bullets, and you crossed to West Jerusalem and life was normal. And people, I hate to say it, looked like, oh, it's not our problem. And the problem I see here is when there is no violence, nobody cares. And when there is violence, people get more hardened and they say, see, they hate us. We were always justified to hate them. And that's the only solution. And even as somebody who spent the last 20 some years doing peace work, I'm often puzzled with Israel and Palestine, and especially working with both of these communities is like, when it's calm, it's because we did it. And when it's violence, it's because they are evil. And how do you break through that feeling? How do you go beyond then, okay, let's really do something when it's not violent? I remember being on an Era Meme event the night before, on Thursday last week. And I was saying that, in my opinion, it was the way you need to really get people to do something before it hits that bad. If 10,000 Israelis and 10,000 Palestinians showed up at Sheikh Jarrah, it would have been different. But only 200 Israelis and 200 Palestinians showed up. So it doesn't send a message.
Sorry, Joe, except for COVID, Aziz. I mean, COVID created this sense of calm.
Right.
That is not, I mean, none of us
the calm before the storm.
So what I'll say is, look, firstly, it's a very important question, and one that peacemaking should never make you comfortable. So if you're comfortable doing it, you're doing it fundamentally wrong. Peacemaking is not progressive. Okay, if it is, then you're only siding with, one part of the political ideology. So it should always make you uncomfortable. But I think that for many, in my experience, there's, people say peace, but what they mean is pacification. They just don't want violence. And by violence, they mean acute violence, as in sort of what we're seeing now. But the structural violence, they're like, fine, whatever. For me, the absence of violence is not peace. Okay, like the absence of acute violence is not peace. And I think that for many people, they believe it is. The absence of violence is a possibility to start dealing with the structural violence that is undergirding the injustice of what's going on. Because as you mentioned, Aziz just dropped off, but I'm sure he'll come back. Like the challenge is violence creates unequal separation. So right now there's violence and everyone's focused on it and it drives people nuts and it creates a lot of separation. We're going to see barriers and walls. We're going to see violence. We're going to see a lot of unequal separation that comes from this. And it is an ability to catch attention, but it blocks off any space to deal with the underlying structural issues. No one wants to talk about the siege in Gaza while there's rockets flying. No one wants to talk about housing issues in Sheikh Jarrah while there's violence going on. Like it's just, there's no time. It just, no one is interested in that. And I understand the catch-22 that Palestinians, whether they sit in Israel, whether they sit in Jerusalem, whether they sit in the West Bank, Gaza, or in the diaspora, feel deeply frustrated that it's an all-lose situation. But for me, the difficulty is the recognition, of course, of the asymmetry of power, while also tackling the symmetry of fear. And that's really complicated. How do you tackle the symmetry of fear that the populations, according to every single vote, are scared of each other? And yet there's clearly an asymmetric power dynamic that's going on, that in between the areas of acute violence, Palestinians face structural violence on a daily basis. So I recognize the frustration, but I will say, Aziz, the last thing is the movement that is creating shared society, and even the cross-border movement that is just structurally weaker, is not the same movement as it was 4 years ago. It's not the same movement it was 8 years ago, and it's definitely not the same movement it was 20 years ago. I think that they have learned the lessons about how they build equity. Like within Israel, they no longer call themselves a coexistence movement. It's a shared society movement because it's about equity. And I do think that the mayors who are standing up is doing that. I think it's more difficult in Jerusalem because there are such national forces that are trying to reduce any equity that Palestinians have in East Jerusalem. But I do think there are strategies and ways in order to do that, because again, the purpose of moving the violence at bay is not then to say, well, we've pacified it. And that's the mistake. And that's where I think so much skepticism comes from. It is then an opportunity to tackle the structural elements of it. And I'll just say, you know, Shai gave a very good timeline of events. We were on the verge for the first time since 1993 of a coalition government reliant on Arab citizens' votes. On the verge, completely taking away the biggest structural roadblock to Arab success, Arab equity within Israel. And then actually just before we came on, Naftali Bennett has said he's no longer willing to rely on Mansour Abbas. We need law and order. And so we did a complete 180, right, in terms of what happened. And I do think we can't lose fact that we were on a verge of a breakthrough. And I think that is important and something also to continue to remember. And I'll pause there.
Thank you.
I will continue actually with you, Joel. Can you talk about what our listeners can do? Can they do anything to get involved and to create change?
Look, the first thing is I'm in like a few minds about this. Look, straight out, I think a lot of people would tell you, you need to call for an immediate cessation of violence. You need to be calling your lawmakers to put pressure to tell the parties to stop. Unless you believe there is a military solution to this problem, and I would argue there is not, right? You need to call that. That's issue A, B, C, and D. And I think it's very important that there is a pivot then once it's stopped to then look at how we can start dealing with the structural elements that lead us back to this problem again and again and again. And I think there are lots of opportunities. You know, I spent 7-8 years working on passing now the Nita Emloe Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which now gives $250 million to build grassroots shared society and cross-border peace building in a policy-driven way, not just a scattergun, but finding the governments of the world to really put real resources. So you know, Aziz, as you said, why aren't there 10,000? There's not that much money sloshing around the field, right? It's very difficult. It's hard work. And so to try and build that capacity and that muscle up. But and I'd say, depending on your community, you know, I would always urge people, and this is me, and it's not for everyone, but if what you do and what you advocate, whether it's through your online presence or through calling your representatives, makes you very comfortable and makes you feel like you've got all the answers, I'd ask you to challenge yourself and look at the empathy that's involved. And that's not to say not recognize the asymmetries of what's going on, but a pressure thesis alone of forcing one party or the other to do one thing without moving at all in the other party's direction, I don't think works. I don't, you know, pressure thesis makes you feel very good about yourself because it's all the other person's fault. Now, again, you can recognize asymmetry. You can recognize occupation. You can recognize all the vital things to demonstrate the unequal nature of what's going on and still be, I don't have a solution. If violence was the solution, it would have worked by now, right? So then what is it? I don't know a better way of transforming Israelis' views of Palestinians except for exposure. I don't know. It doesn't help when left-wing Jews tell right-wing Jews Palestinians are really good people, because they're like, well, you're not Palestinian in the hood. We can like, I don't have a solution, Aziz, to your problem, which is more dignified than you being able to be you and being exposed to them who don't know you. I don't know. And so that's not a good answer. It shouldn't make you satisfied or anything else. But I would say that constant challenging of yourself to make sure you're constantly uncomfortable, because that's where peace, if you want to be doing peacemaking, it's fundamentally uncomfortable. And Kim, one last point. I do think the current round of violence has completely demonstrated that the green line is a fiction. I think that's very important. so many funders and so many people say, well, I'm happy to do things within the border, but when it crosses the Green Line, whether it's to East Jerusalem or whether it's to the West Bank, that's, very complicated. People's identities, whether they are Palestinian, Arab citizens of Israel, or whether they're religious Zionists, don't care about the Green Line. They don't see their identity completely divided by an armistice line. They just don't. And while it's been important in international geopolitics, I think when we talk about people and communities, you have to recognize the wholeness of them. Violence happens within Israel between Arabs and Jews when Israelis and Palestinians are in a shooting war. So you can't just pretend it doesn't happen. So I do say if there's one thing moving forward, it's to get away from the mythology of the Green Line as this dividing point, whether it's as a funder or a supporter, you say one thing in one case and another thing in another.
You're mentioning a lot of realizations that are not always easy. I think that it's a difficult task to take on, but those that are interested in it should read and listen and try. Shai and I were talking about this recently, about how it's very difficult for Israelis to make these kinds of realizations about the asymmetric force, about even just saying the word occupation. And these are, as an Israeli, I can tell you that I'm going through these thought changes myself while working at MEJDI. And we're going to start asking the questions from the audience because there are a lot. I'll go to you, Shai, and ask if you can talk about the religious leaders and what their role is in de-escalating the situation. And then Mutassim will go to you to give the other side of it.
We're seeing in the last couple of days is a lack of leadership, and when leaders should take the stand and maybe try to pacify the different sides, but it's not something that we see so much, which means that we're letting people join into this battle in a way by the fact that the leaders are not taking the responsibility and the side that they should. So when we're talking about religion in this sense, we have to remember two things. One, that we're talking about religious symbols. If Israel did something that the Palestinians saw as an attack on Al-Aqsa, which obviously happened, right? We saw the police entering Al-Aqsa, and we saw the violence that happened there. This is something that would mean so much to the Palestinians, as the feeling is that they're the people who are defending Al-Aqsa. So I didn't see any Muslim leader who was talking about how that shouldn't happen, which is something I get, and I think many Israelis get. I think until Monday, until the starting of the shooting of the rockets from Hamas, many Israelis understood that Israel did a mistake. And with what Joel discussed, right, the fact that we're about to change our coalition, change the government, and the fact that Bibi is kind of in his last days in office, was very much understood to Israelis that this is a political act.
Well, not anymore. He might be in office for much longer now.
Exactly, which is what we thought that would happen. But think of the Israelis as well. So they were demonstrating, many of them, against Netanyahu for a full year. It happened to be that they were on the verge of changing the coalition. It was very obvious to Israelis that the Jerusalem decisions were made wrong and poorly. But from that moment, they feel that they have to take a side. From the moment that Hamas joins in and starts shooting the rockets. So imagine, right? I live in Tel Aviv, yeah. So does Kim. For the last 2 nights, we've been running to shelters in the middle of the night. And these are days that for many Israelis is very difficult to take an empathic side. I don't think they shouldn't. Obviously they should, and obviously things are way worse in Gaza than they are in Tel Aviv. But on days like those, the Israelis are saying, you know what, even if I go demonstrate with Palestinians, they feel that they would be offended.
Shai, just because a question came that relates to this, that says, is there a connection between the increased violence toward Palestinians and Netanyahu's political problems? Do you think those two are connected?
Can you repeat the question, Aziz?
Between Netanyahu's political problems and increased violence toward Palestinians.
So me personally, I definitely see the connection. And I think that if from years ago we would talk about connections like that, and not so many Israelis would follow and support that, on the last term, I mean, on what's happening in the last month, many more Israelis are talking about it loud and clear and talking about how the coalition change obviously is leading to that. But the moment the rockets are starting to fly from Gaza, the Israelis are feeling that they are uniting against that cause. And if they go demonstrate with Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, and not so many Israelis do, okay? We're talking about a few hundreds for the very most. And Hamas is also shooting rockets in order to free and save Sheikh Jarrah, then which side are they on exactly? And
Well,
this is, I think, for them, yeah.
I'll just say, I think just like the increased violence helps Netanyahu, this, in my opinion, this violence also helps Hamas significantly. And that's my personal view. I think the Sheikh Jarrah, you've been there, so you know I've been there. I never saw anybody that I recognized as a Hamas person, and none of the Hamas leadership really were as involved in it. None of the Fatah leadership also were as involved in it. It was, and the whole movement in Al-Aqsa and in Sheikh Jarrah was not political movement, was not even religious movement. I mean, people who don't go to the mosque at all were going out at Al-Aqsa and protesting. It was really fascinating. And in some ways, this gave Hamas an opening to gain popularity on the account of Fatah, on the account of the Palestinian Authority, saying, we are the ones who are willing to defend you. I think people in Sheikh Jarrah had more success before that, personally. And that's not what every Palestinian thinks. I think there's a division, just like you said, among Israelis. I know Palestinians who would disagree with me. But maybe that takes me to Mu'tasim about the question Kim asked you, and about how is this? I mean, I know a lot of people, at least I know, are frustrated by responses by the Palestinian leadership, by, you know, what's really happening, who's leading right now. And I know not just maybe religious leadership, but political leadership. Do you see any leadership coming out of what's happening?
Well, first, let me start with the first question, which is what role did the religious leaders took in that case? At the very beginning, before Monday, no doubt that none of the religious leaders, if we got some in quotation, let's say religious leaders in the Palestinian communities, would dare to ask people to calm down a little bit, or to just be patient more, because it was extremely nervous. There were huge tents, right? But and that continued as well. That continued after Monday. So none of the leaders, none of the Palestinian leaders in the West Bank at the moment, again in quotation, if we got the real leaders, um, would even dare to think about requesting people to come down and requesting people to reduce that, or to not support, let's say, what's going on right now. What happened, let's say the cancellation, I don't want to say pushing of the elections, but I personally believe it was a cancellation of the Palestinian elections, led to such a huge reaction and then the Palestinian community, for a couple of important reasons. First, all of us, I mean, in the West Bank, I'm talking about generally about the youth, believe that the Palestinian Authority at the moment is not real national authority. They believe that it's mostly a Zionist authority, but called the Palestinian Authority, right? The biggest majority of the community, and that's because of the security coordination, because of arresting the activists, even the activists who are away from violence, right, who believe in peaceful resistance, or what they call it, the beautiful resistance, that the dictatorship that Mahmoud Abbas is taking at the moment and his party. So all of that played a role, right? And that reminds us with 2006, when the elections took place. I know Christians who voted for Hamas because they wanted to punish Fatah, right? And the leadership of Hamas were quite smart to take the advantage of what's going on, right? That's the first thing. The second thing, the way that Hamas started the war this time, in my opinion, was extremely smart, right? Because at the beginning, the speaker of them, just give me a second, sorry.
Kids are misbehaving.
You know, it's the Eid, it's the feast, and visitors. So anyway, I got a very hyperactive daughter. Shai knows her well, so And she means to annoy me now because I told her to get to her room. Anyway, so so what I was saying that the way they started it, that they give a time, they give a time label for the Israeli. If you don't stop it by 6 o'clock, we're gonna shoot. And they knew very well that it won't stop, that the march will go on, that the police officers and the soldiers won't be away from the mosque, and won't be away from Sheikh Jarrah. So they did it, and they know that they gave the as what we say in Arabic, they put the stick in front of the shepherd. That's an Arabic expression, means that they just gave you threat you. If you don't do it, if you don't do what we say, we're gonna punish you with whatever, right? It's like the parents. They know that you won't get 100% in the school, but you won't get your favorite doll unless you get 100% in the school, right? That's what we do with our kids. So that's exactly what Hamas did, and that also gained a huge support, let's say, in the West Bank, especially after the frustration of the cancellation of the elections, the corruption. So they considered now Hamas and Islamic Jihad, for most of the Palestinians, considered to be the shield, the real shield of Palestinians against the occupation, right? And look, the situation at the moment just made me find an answer that I got in my mind. A couple of years ago, Shai took me to Yad Vashem, to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And one of the most things that amazed me, that why the Nazi soldiers were telling the victims that we're taking you to take showers, and then they execute them. So why don't they just tell them, go, you would be executed, right? So basically because they wanted them to keep the hope of life. But we know that earlier, the Nazis did everything to make people lose the hope of being um, released and liberated from the slavery and from the pain they've got. So after they killed the hope in them to be released from the jails, they gave them a hope to stay alive to avoid their reaction. And that's, in my opinion, what happened at the what really you can measure to what happened at the moment. I'm not saying that what's happening is a Holocaust, but I mean the same idea. So that the radical right wing in Israel, who unfortunately were in the government for so many years, and recently they got more seats in the last elections than the left, that gave an impression to the Palestinians that you got nothing to do. I mean, you're facing only a settlement government, a government with a settlement, with a settlement mentality, very radical, very right wing. And Netanyahu, they call him the sheep of the settlers. So whatever the settler says, Netanyahu would say amen. So they got no hope. They found they reached a moment that there is no hope that it's gonna be better soon, right? So since they lost the hope, that what make the situation explode. Plus the lots of tents, and it all came together with the crimes in Israel. So that's what made the Israeli Arabs being involved in that. Plus the religious motions that played the role, that Al-Aqsa Mosque is attacked, is in a risk and a danger. All of that played a big role with the explosion. Then the reactions of the settlers, and the worst was the reaction of the official government of the settlers, like the one who was killed in Lod, the Palestinian guy who was killed in Lod. One of the Israeli ministers, I believe, said that if it was in my hand, I want to arrest them. I want to arrest the settlers. So even that made the Palestinians in Israel, or the Israeli Arabs, who were perfectly in many cases like Haifa. To be honest, as a Palestinian, I was surprised of their actions in Haifa and Akko, because we know that there is at least the impression here that they got a perfect, let's say, co-living together. I mean, there is a perfect relations between Jews and Arabs over there. But it took the tense and the violence took a place over there because of that. Now, again, add to that the frustration of the Palestinians in the West Bank. Add to that, for Gaza, they say they got nothing to lose, basically because they're in the siege for 15 years or 16 years now. So all of that just exploded the situation. It was already tense. It was pretty much pressured, and now it just exploding. Let's hope that it comes down very soon. Just want to comment on what Joel said, that the absence of violence doesn't mean peace. I 100% agree with you. If it was really comfortable to deal with peacemaking, then you probably failed your mission. It's not really easy, especially at the moment. I mean, these moments, in my opinion, are the most tense, the most important moments in the history of the whole country. In a second, it could be a civil war, or if the international community interacted, interfered, could stop. So, but it's really confusing for the locals.
Thank you, Mu'tasim. Kim, I don't have access to the questions anymore because I was booted out
Okay,
and in. So
no problem.
you're gonna
I'm
have to decide that.
sure. I'm going back to the internal conflicts or riots that are going on in Israel. And there's a question here about the police. So the police were very active and apparent when the riots were against Bibi Netanyahu. And right now it seems like they're not really capable, or in some spots not even there, to stop what is happening. Shai, can you comment on that? Do you want to give a sense of what people are thinking about this?
Yeah. So the last 2 years for the police, I think, were difficult years for the police itself as well, because they had no chief of staff in office. They had kind of a replacement for a while. There's a new minister of police, Amir Ohana, which is one of the closest people to Netanyahu and perceived as a very political character in Israel. So on all of that, I think the police came first and foremost unprepared for what's going on right now. And on the last year, if we can say the biggest threat in a way for the police was the demonstrations against Netanyahu, we saw major arrests for those protests against Netanyahu. They were all very peaceful protests. I was in many of them. And we saw the police coming in and arresting sometimes 40 and 50 people. On the next day, they would come to people's homes who are usually protesting and telling them that they either need to come to the police station or kind of threatening them on their role on the demonstrations against Netanyahu. So I guess if the police would really want, they could have a better way to react. But what we're seeing in the last 72 hours is that the police has lost it. There's no other way for me to say it. The police lost it. The fact that we have civilians in Israel, in the mixed cities, especially in Akka and in Lod, but Jaffa, and there's others as well, who are rioting, and we see Jews who are trying to lynch Arabs and succeeding on some level in some places. We're also seeing, of course, a mirror picture of that. And there's a competition, of course, of who's lynching. Like each side is saying, oh, they're lynching more than us, which is a very shameful competition to take a part of. I think the police is incapable of helping. We are hearing calls to the police and people are begging them to come and save their lives. And the police cannot do that. And the question obviously is, why isn't the Minister of Police doing anything above that power? We have other groups in Israel, obviously, that could help if he has to bring the army in or I don't know whom. But obviously the police kind of lost it. And the real question, I would guess, is who's taking that gap? Because if the police doesn't come in, somebody's going to come in. And in the city of Lod yesterday, we saw some of the most troubling things that we saw, I guess, from the history of the country. We saw civilians who are coming in armed. Many settlers came in armed to Lod to help their fellow Jews, which was one thing. On the other hand, we know that in the Arab community in Israel, we know that there is an issue with guns, right? Unauthorized guns. This is happening for over a decade, and people are shouting. Palestinian, Israeli, Arab Israeli members of the Knesset are calling for a change and are asking and begging the government to execute a program that is already written and to put those 2.5 billion shekels in order to pick up those guns. But you know, the Israeli government and I guess the police said something like, if those Arabs are shooting themselves, then it's an inner Arab issue. And nothing really was done in order to stop that. Maybe just a few things. But now those guns are shifting. They're targeting Israelis. And we're seeing neglection of many years coming now into reality. Those are things that many organizations were threatening and were warning from. And we're talking about how those issues would one day explode in our face. But, you know, everybody's saying, yeah, you're threatening, you're warning, the world will boycott Israel because of politics, international law. But so far, you know, things in Israel were relatively calm. And the last 72 hours have shown a very different reality. And right now, I believe that the police has just no way to stop the violence. And I guess that on some places, they don't really want to. But even if they would, there's no way for them to really do that.
Shai, do you think, and like you said, I think we each see different videos, and I get sent obviously more of videos of the lynches that happens to Palestinians. I would assume most Israelis see the opposite, the lynches happening to Israelis. But one of the things I keep hearing, and I can't objectively say it's true or not, and I wonder your view, is that when the police comes, they're not even-handed. Meaning, if they're coming to stop a Palestinian riot, they actually show up. But if it's what was happening in Lud yesterday, then they don't really show up. Is that anywhere true, or is this more of an exaggeration of people?
I think it's hard to tell. Honestly, it's hard to tell. What we see in the last couple of days is also mass fake news who's coming in and kind of trying to change reality. I saw so many WhatsApp messages from groups talking about how Arabs are rioting to attack Jews and Jews are rioting to attack Arabs, which were false, which didn't happen. So to be honest and to perfectly answer your question, I think we have to let the smoke come down and then investigate. Because so far, I don't know what to tell you. I saw a couple of lynches that happened to Jews and the police didn't come, at least not on time. And obviously the mirror picture, but I don't know to tell if there is one-sided act of the police. It could be, by the way. I'm not saying that there isn't, but right now it's still very difficult to tell.
I think this is manifested of a lack of trust of, citizens, whether they do trust the police or don't trust the police. And I think at least I think majority of people, and I would say even not just Palestinians, even Israelis, who don't really trust the police.
Aziz, I just want to add something onto what Shai said about the nature of the police today, because I think it's important, because it's very difficult. Israel's not like the United States or the UK or many, I don't know where other people are watching. The police are controlled by a central authority, okay, in terms of the Interior Security Minister. And given the fact that the Prime Minister has been under investigation by the police now for what, Shai, 3 years? Are we now up to year number 3, maybe year number 2, whatever it might be? Like in terms of since the indictments were filed, there has been an ongoing political attack on the justice system and of the police, and the police who are reliant on politicians for their advancement at the highest echelons are aware of this. And if you've got one set pushing community policing, which you would say is the building of trust, and another set pushing law and order, and meanwhile the elite forces in the police in terms of the top criminal investigation units are being hammered by the politicians as corrupt. This all has a case of when you're, in the UK, you'd say a Bobby on the beat, but if you're a stum cop in Israel, right? And you're trying to work out, what do I do in order to advance my career? What's the answer? I'm not saying, therefore, you should have, right. I'm not saying this to humanize the institution, but to humanize the individuals in many ways, right? Like the lack of clarity that Israel has been under without a stable government has multiple effects. And this is one of them. Right, you can't plan a massive anti-crime part in the Arab community when the police itself is under attack by the very prime minister. Right, like it's this bizarro world of what's going on, and I think that this is a consequence of living in liminality, right, in between zones for so long as a country.
Kim,
I
other questions?
I want to comment on Joel if we have time shortly. You tell me.
Go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think both sides here are feeling it's even a bit more than lack of trust, because the Palestinian citizens of Israel, they feel targeted by the police. They feel the police is not their police. The police is never coming in when they're needed, and this is not an unusual story. So this is something that's been always going on from the martial law in Israel until the year 66, but even of course in the last 1 year, and it's emphasized on the mixed cities, because the mixed cities in Israel are going through a change. And the change has been going on for the last 15 years when we're seeing groups, it's called seeds or roots of national religious Jews, where kind of centers in those cities. The city of Lod has 30% who is Arab, but also 5% of the national Jews who shifted, and after the 2005 disengagement from Gaza, and after some success in Judea and Samaria, or a lot of success, they shifted into cities within Israel, and that is also changing a lot of the reality in those cities. Now, for the Jews, what they're seeing in the last 3 days is back to the places where they came from, back to anti-Semitic clashes that they had, where we're talking about burned synagogues and lynches to Jews it's just bringing back memories from the last hundreds of years, wherever they were, from 1921 that we're now commemorating 100 years, seen in Israel as the first attack from Palestinians to Israelis. And this is something that is awakening in them a very strong emotion that usually doesn't come in. Israel is a majority of Jews. 75% of Israelis are Jews. They control all the systems in the country. They control the police. They control the government. And yet there's a feeling of a minority that never left for the Israeli Jews. And it is fully emphasized in the last 3 days. And it's always coming back to that. And sadly, I think this is what's happening also right now.
And one additional layer, sorry not to, is that the ideologies that the Garanim and also these cities bring, right? So you have the Northern Islamic movement in Lod, okay? You have parts of the more extreme parts of the religious Zionist community in Lod. And so you have clashing religious ideologies. So I saw questions about religious leaders. Look, there have been attempts, and there have been the chief rabbis of Israel. You've seen different sheikhs, Sheikh Ra'ad Mansour, Sheikh Riyad in Kfar Qasim, who's the head of the Southern Islamic movement. You've seen the people in the Waqf. You have seen religious leaders. We shouldn't say they're absent, they're trying. You know, a lot of it is disproving to each other's 25-year-olds that the other one is trying, right? So a lot of it's how do you break through the filter bubbles and translate from Arabic to Hebrew the religious messaging. And during the beginning of this with TikTok, it was actually very effective. You had Haredi leaders in Jerusalem coming out with statements that were translated into Arabic and shared with people in East Jerusalem that they were saying not to go and attack. And you had Sheikh Imad very much saying to his followers, saying under no circumstances should you be doing this TikTok violence, and that was shared with the Haredim. But like, again, if you also have the pressure nationally with what was going on with Sheikh Jarrah, and that's a completely different issue, the ability to tamper down the violence from religious authorities is completely limited. So I shouldn't say that they're absent, they're trying, but it's insanely difficult.
I think to start summing up, there's a question we've been asked on Facebook. If you see any Palestinian or Israeli leaders who give you hope for the future. And I know this is not an easy question either, but maybe we can start moving towards
we
hope.
can see them all here. We have Mu'tasim, we have Shai, who are both, by the way, who are both active. So they're not just here because they are tour guides. They are active in their communities. I mean, when I went to Sheikh Jarrah, I asked Shai about the previous weeks, how it was, how would I, should I expect, what kind of violence, all those questions I asked him because he was there way more than I have been. He's Israeli and Palestinian, and yet he's been there way more than I have been. So I think you definitely see some of those Israelis and Palestinians in this conversation. So we'll start with that. But do you want to add some more people? Both of you, you're welcome to. Or Joel, I know you also know a lot of people in the region, so feel free.
Mu'tasim, you go ahead. Who's the leaders you see? I know this is a question you've been waiting for all session.
No, really, well, this is the question that I don't really want to face because, to be honest, I mean, from the Palestinian side, unfortunately, one of the main disasters or one of the main issues in the Palestinian community that there is a real absence of a real trusted leader. So, to be honest, that makes it very hazy for us. So, personally, I don't see any at the moment. So far, none of the Palestinian politicians, in my personal opinion, and I think. I don't want to. I would assume. I don't want to say that for sure, but I assume that the majority of the Palestinian youth don't really see a good political leader at the moment, right? And none of the politicians, right? But I believe that we need, in my opinion, first we need to look for a real new movements, and that's almost impossible especially at the moment.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Mu'tasim. That's true more maybe in the West Bank. I think the last few weeks have made me feel more hopeful in Jerusalem because even despite the lack of leadership, people were organizing and doing incredible work that to me was shocking. Even when the police stopped people from coming to pray on Friday from the Triangle, from Israel, it was Palestinians in Jerusalem who organized and started taking buses and cars. And And they didn't need that normal leadership of Fatah and Hamas and all these groups. And
That's
maybe
100%
I'm
true.
being too hopeful, but I hope we are breaking away from these political parties to create community leadership that is not anymore owned by somebody sitting in Ramallah who still has not left his office to meet anybody since all of these problems started, which to me is, at least Netanyahu, as much as I can't stand him, went to Lud. Our leader didn't leave his office the whole time. He spoke in camera for 2 minutes, which was his way of talking to us, which is why nobody sees him as a leader.
It's true about the situation here in the West Bank. It's quite different than Jerusalem and then
Right.
Israeli Arabs for a couple of important reasons. First, of the economical situation. The secondly, that we're gonna lie if we say that the memories of the second Intifada, the invasions, and the whole stuff have just been it's ignored, but it's not forgotten, right? So it's not erased, it's ignored. So people still believe here. We got the feeling that we need a political leader, we need a movement, we need a party. We can't do it ourselves. But knowing that a few years ago, when the Palestinian Authority tried to apply a law of social insurance, that we knew very well that was just to steal more money from the Palestinians. Nobody needed a leader. Just people went randomly in the streets and they dropped the government. The government collapsed. The government of Alhamdulillah. I'm pretty sure you remember it, right? So, but when it comes to the local issues, to the material issues, let's call it, if it's the correct way to use, the correct word to use. I think that the majority of the people in the West Bank believes that we need politicians to lead us. We don't need it. We can do it by ourselves, just by that. But when it comes to relations with the other side, in quotation, we need definitely. That's what people believe, that we need politicians, and not a weak politician. One of the things that made Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas as an idiot for the majority of the Palestinians, that he's powerless. He's not trying to find a PowerPoint, his own points of power to use it with the negotiations. And I've heard that a lot through the last 4 days or 5 days, that you see when Hamas say that they're gonna shoot rockets if they don't do that, the Israeli just, even they did it, they didn't care for Hamas said, but even though that was a message of threat, that we got a power, we can do something, we can harm you, right? So that also bring more back to the Palestinian mentality in the West Bank, that we should have such a power, militant power, whatever power, negotiations.
Yeah, I think probably one of the worst things about what's happening now is more the failure, as much as I don't like the Palestinian Authority, but the failure of the Palestinian Authority is through these years by saying, look, we need to negotiate, we need to have peace, and failing to bring anything tangible to Palestinians, while Hamas is, shooting rockets and acting like a hero to people, saying, look, we at least can do something, is unfortunately going to push more and more Palestinians toward believing that there is no negotiated peace. We can't fix this through peaceful matters. And I personally believe that's wrong. The problem we have is we got terrible leadership. It's not that you can't do it without violence, but the current situation, just like it's making more Israelis gonna turn probably to being more right and more radical, it's definitely could turn more Palestinian into that direction, unless we figure out ways to really push through. And if anything from this meeting, I don't want people to leave thinking, oh well, it's all doomed. But we have to face reality, is that we are in a tough situation. I can't tell you, look at the news, look how horrible things are, and just be 100% hopeful. I'm saying it is going to be rough, but that's why we have to start thinking and working hard to make a difference and make a change. Talk to each other, ask each other questions. Look, most Palestinians didn't have the chance to ask Shai the questions I asked him about the police. Most Israelis didn't have the chance to ask me and Mu'tasim the questions they asked about. So what's happening in Gaza? What's happening in Jerusalem? What's this whole story with Sheikh Jarrah? Most Israelis don't know where is Sheikh Jarrah. Forget about even the story of Sheikh Jarrah. So we need to figure out more mechanisms to be more engaged rather than giving up. And I hope you leave with that sense, is we need to empower those kind of efforts and those kind of mechanisms.
Aziz, before you leave, and I wanted to give Shai the last word rather than me, because he's on the ground, but not so much individuals, but we did see, as of last week, a remarkable ability for Israeli politicians to disappoint their communities at a rate they could accept. And, there's a form of leadership, as you rightly in your way criticize Mahmoud Abbas, it's because he didn't disappoint his community at a rate he could accept. He just disappointed his community, right? It didn't do anything, right? There was no movement that went with it. What was remarkable about what was happening in Israel was, for better or worse, there was this moment that has now been crushed, but we'll see if it's reborn, where shibboleths and white elephants were being slain, and there was an opportunity to really break through some structural barriers that started on a communal level, that went to the municipal and joint cities and moved its way up, so that people knew each other and they understood, and it came up. I'm not an Islamist, but I am inspired by Mansour Abbas's statements and words, not just over the past week or weeks, but like in terms of his ability, in terms of how he speaks to a right-wing.
Just so people know, Mansour Abbas is a member of Knesset who leads one of the parties there, and he comes from an Islamic party.
And I can see Nazar, yes, disappointing your community at rate you could accept is not mine as Ron Heifetz. And I could see Nazar in the quotes being very happy for adaptive leadership. But the point being, it is remarkable to watch. It's not easy. People are worried for his life. And that's not a criticism on Ayman Odeh or anyone else in the joint list who have other segments of the community they have to represent. But the maturation of the Arab community's voting blocks in a way that there is a multiplicity of voices and views, just like there are in the Jewish community and the Zionist community, is healthy. And I would say that when I look for hope, I look for more of the maturation rather than just ethnically driven politics that says because you're an Arab, you can't participate. And whether that means that they side on the same political part of the map that I agree with or not, I think it's very important and encouraging. And the more that we can see that, and let's see what happens with Gideon Sa'ar, who is the last right winger who might be able to continue to kosher it. I don't know if he's going to be able to. That's where I find some hope, that we haven't completely backed up the truck. Mansour Abbas hasn't just thrown up his hands and said this was pointless. And so let's see if that does still have a voting base. Let's see if there's still a voting base in the Jewish community after this. But that does bring me some hope, at least within the Israeli polity, that it's not all doom and gloom.
I'm on the difficult spot here because I'm coming from the Israeli left wing, and we're not the most beloved group within the Israeli politics system. It happened to be with many mistakes that were done in the past that are, I think the criticism about the Israeli left is the fact that they were patronizing or misbehaved many of the communities in Israel. So I think gathering power again and coming to the future should be done through what Joel mentioned before, through future of shared reality or shared life between Jews and Palestinians, Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, Palestinians who aren't. We have a few organizations that are doing that. We have from Omdim B'Yachad, Standing Together, which is a shared organization of Palestinian citizens of Israel with Israelis. We have Combatants for Peace, which is a strong organization, or let's say an important organization shared between Palestinians and Israelis. Out of the politicians, I think pointing two names should be Aida Tuma Suleiman from Hamdash and from the Joint List. She's a very prominent woman, and I think that already the changes that she's done in the society are wonderful, and I see a great future on that as well. And maybe from Meretz, Mossi Raz, it is very committed to shared life between Palestinians and Israelis. He made it really on the edge, but he's back to parliament. And on last Monday, when we had Jerusalem Day, he had a talk in the Knesset talking about Sheikh Jarrah and trying to change one of the laws that is enabling the settlers to go into the neighborhood. This is where I see the future. I think we have a lot of work ahead, especially after all of this shitstorm would end. But this is where I put my hopes.
Yeah, and I just want to say I fully agree with you, especially on Mossi, who I've known for 15 years and I've never maybe there are very few people who are as committed and really truly committed as he is. I'm not a fan of everything Meretz does. There are times I really struggle with it, but he's an individual that's just incredible. And by the way, for those who traveled with us, he often spoke to our groups, and a fantastic human being. And he came up with the idea of Meretz maybe having a joint leadership, Arab Jewish leadership, not just one person. He wanted to push for that, to make it really a joint party, not a Jewish Zionist party, but to be a joint party as well. So he's a visionary person. So I'm a fan. I just want to remind people, there's so much lack of understanding of what's happening. So please remember, if you can, share these stories with people, share this video. You can find it on Facebook, and I assume we'll put it probably on our website as soon as we can. It'll take probably half a day or a day before it can go on our website. So please do that. I'll also say we will be, we're still figuring it out. We'll be engaging more and more through our nonprofit Interact in over there. So we've been working recently with tour guides. We're looking at creating a place for Israelis and Palestinians to learn about each other narratives. So Kim and I, the last few weeks, have been working on that, working with partners and how to do it, creating a center of dual narrative in Israel and Palestine. So this is something we are working on, and it's something that I think will answer some of those questions, not just come to dialogue for the sake of dialogue, but really understand and figure out how to work together and how to make a difference together. So this is something we have to keep thinking about. We don't just talk and like each other, but we do work together to make a difference and change realities on the ground. And as long as we can convince more and more of us, Israelis and Palestinians, to stand together, make differences on the ground, I think we can make a difference. If we, to me, as I watched so many of these violences happen, it shows for me the weakness of some of the coexistence talks we have, because coexistence in the sense of me and you going and eating hummus together is not coexistence. Coexistence is us really getting to know each other, be able to be honest and transparent, talk and fight about even some of these issues, and eventually find a common ground in which we can work on to increase or to bring social justice to both of our communities. Unless we partner together, it's not really reconciliation. The image that we can take a selfie of an Arab and a Jew standing next to each other, that's not reconciliation. It's an actual hard work that often isn't seen on camera. That is reconciliation work and peace work. So let's continue to do that, because only through that you stop seeing people as Arabs and Jews. Just like in Sheikh Jarrah, when you go to a protest there, you don't care who's Arab and who's Jewish. We together. It doesn't matter. And I think that's the hope that I want to leave us with, is at some point, as you do this work, you stop seeing people based on their ethnicity and religion and politics and so on.
And we're inviting you all to join the continued conversations. And if you enjoyed this, feel free to visit our website. You'll find all of our previous live stream episodes. And there's also links to a podcast system as well. We were very happy to host the three of you. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your insight. Super interesting, great conversation, and I would say kind of a never-ending conversation. Thanks to these governments, thanks to the communities. Hopefully we will find something better to talk about in the coming years. So thank you all again for joining. And Aziz always says,
it's not where you travel, but it's how.
Bye-bye.